In this episode of Inside the Artist, renowned author and poet Emiliano Martin talks about the many styles of poetry while sharing his own published work to give us all an insight as to what poetry can be. Good afternoon. Today is August 16th, 2022, and we're Inside the Artist, and today we're stopping by to see renowned author, poet, and artist Emiliano Martin. We found out that he recently had written a poem about the different types of poetry. Mr. Martin, how are you today?
Okay, John.
Can you tell us about that poem you wrote about different types of poetry?
Well, it is a poem in which I relate the different moods and subjects and themes that are within the poem itself. It's just, I go down through a litany of the different variations of the mood of the poet.
Do you have that handy to read to the readers?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it's one of the poems I have recited in most of my poetry readings. It almost became a classic.
Oh, wow.
Almost without knowing it. But to answer your question.
Yeah, I'm sure viewers would love to hear it.
Yes, I have a poem. I call it Poetry Can Be. Poetry can be fantasy, coming from a dreamer. Poetry can be joyful, coming from a happy man. Poetry can be inspiring, coming from a winner. Poetry can be romantic, coming from the heart. Poetry can be sensual, coming from a lover. Poetry can be meaningful, coming from a philosopher. Poetry can be religious, coming from a nun. Poetry can be inexplicable, coming from an intellectual. Poetry can be funny, coming from a comedian. Poetry can be sad, coming from a loser. Poetry can be interesting, coming from a thinker. Poetry can be a melody, coming from her lips. Poetry can be depressing, coming from a tortured mind. Poetry can be political, coming from a radical. Poetry can be crude, coming from an angry man. Poetry can be irrational, coming from a wannabe. Poetry can be obscene, coming from a pervert. Poetry can be senseless, coming from an idiot. Poetry can be cruel, coming from a madman. Poetry can be lost, coming from the field of emptiness. Poetry can be just about anything we want it to be, but unforgotten, wise and sincere, coming from poets like you and me.
Wow, who knew poetry can be all those things? Well, obviously you did. You wrote a wonderful poem that you just shared with us.
Thank you.
And speaking of that poem, you mentioned about poetry can be fantasy. Like, what, do you have any examples?
Of course, poetry can be fantasy because it's in the mind of a poet. The poet imagines things either based on his dreams or experiences or whatever happened around him or her. So yes, poetry can be fantasy.
Do you have a fantasy poem you'd like to read?
As a matter of fact, I wrote a poem about that subject.
Oh, great.
I call it And Glances. Chances and glances carefully crafted by two daring hearts wrapped in a blanket of shining stars. Truly in alignment with one thought in mind. Chances and glances often cut in half, holding on to memories that were not enough. In the mind of a poet, of course.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know the one thing we all need today is joy. And you mentioned something about poetry can be joyful. What do you mean by that?
Poetry can be joyful, of course, based on actions, happenings around the poet that make him or her happy about what's going on. So yes, poetry can be happy.
And another one you had mentioned that you hit on was poetry can be inspiring. What does that mean?
Poetry is inspiring, or can be inspiring, if the poet pays attention to what is going on around. Anything that happens around a person can be captured by the poet's mind, and he or she, when he or she pen down the thoughts on paper, it's an inspiration.
Do you have an example you like to read for us?
Of course. Moonshine. A moon of pale above my breath shines unaware of loving the surrounding times we share. With energy, giving each other some rhyming words, the lips of poetry, and blowing kisses, often disguised in fantasy. In this case, the moon, the shining of the moon, gave the poet an inspiration to write something about it.
Or somebody could bark at it too.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the moon, you said poetry can be romantic. What do you mean by that?
If a person is in love with people, with objects, with houses, with cars, yes, there is a sense of romanticism about anything in life, and the poet can write about it. One of the romantic poems I have written is called Yes, I Know. I do know that when we met, it was fire at a glance. And ever since, we've learned how to dance with each other fondness. But I can honestly say that I never had the chance to carry out the desire of holding her in my arms. There is a sense of romanticism in that piece.
That's nice. On the style a little bit of romantic, and in today's society, the PC world we have to watch, I know you talked about poetry can be sensual. What do you mean by that?
The poet, either a female or a male, can get into the sensuality of his, her thinking. And then the poem can be extremely sensual, almost X-rated if you push it. But yes, definitely.
Do you have one you can read that won't get us in trouble?
Well, there is a poem I can get away with it, because even though it is kind of a sensual, it's not pornography. So, intimacy. Her murmuring sighs on my ear, tenderly patting my heart, makes vibrations of my feelings to blend at ease with her own. Ignoring our surroundings, with singular affluence, both of us dive in deep waters to touch bottom of a sea, made of waves no one can see, even though we are wide open to our intimacy.
Nice.
It's kind of,
They could have used that in the movie where they had the guy make love to the fish.
Indeed.
Meaningful. You had mentioned something about meaningful. I know there's some poets that just write for the sake of writing, but you're saying that some poets write with meaning behind it? What do you mean?
In the poet's mind, there is meaning to everything he writes. It's the way it is. In the poet's mind, he's right. He's always right. He's the author of the piece of paper. but it may be meaningful for the poet, but it may not be meaningful for somebody else. Unfortunately, not everyone likes poetry.
Do you have a poem that you've written so we can see what you meant?
Going back to the idea of a poem can be meaningful, the poem offers a vision that is in the mind of a poet, and the poet wants to transmit that vision to everyone. There is a poem I have written about that specific subject, and I call it a vision. First, it is a vision. Then, it is a thought, looking for shelter, to become one of my poems written on a piece of paper.
Nice.
That's meaningful to me.
Something else that some people either need or don't want nothing to do with, you talked about poetry can be religious. Why?
There are people who believe in religion, whatever the religion is, and it can be a turn off, because not everybody's into religion or politics or anything like that, and some priests have done a lot of writing about the subject, but again, it's a very specific subject that is for very few people.
Another subject you mentioned, another type of poetry, you said it can be inexplicable. What does that mean?
Intellectual people usually write poetry that no one understands, and they get away with it because the intellectuals like to write poetry so that later on they can talk about it, creating the illusion that they know what they're doing. And of course, that is a turn off to the average people in the street, because they cannot relate to this kind of poetry written by intellectuals. They are very good writers. They are very well educated people, but it's only for them. It doesn't work for the guy in the street.
Speaking of funny, you said poetry can also be funny. How?
Well, there are some people who have a sense of humor and know how to put things in perspective and make us laugh with a simple poem. Could be a limerick, could be a couplet, could be something simple that, or a very long poem if they are good at it. But yes, poetry can be funny.
Now, the opposite of funny, you said poetry can be sad.
Poetry can be sad, definitely, because poetry is feelings about an individual. Poetry is a description of happenings around us, and sometimes these happenings are not truly happy, are sad events. So, unfortunately, poetry can be sad.
Do you have a sad poem you'd like to share?
I wrote a piece some time ago I called Finding Sadness, and it goes like this. I could find sadness in a flowerless garden, in a colorless rainbow, trying to call our attention like if we were nearly blind. I could find sadness in a fountain with no water, in a child without a smile. When the world cannot play music and people cannot sing or dance. I could find sadness in a dancer without feet, in a poem without voice, or a mural without art, and a painter with no canvas, crying out loud from the heart. Oh yes, I could find sadness in a kite without sky, or the stringless old guitar in a forgotten made promises, or a day without sunlight.
Interesting.
All those things can bring sadness in an individual, especially on the poet's mind.
And speaking of interesting, you had said that poetry can be interesting. What do you mean?
Poetry can be interesting if the poet is able to transmit something of interest to the individual who is reading or listening to the poetry. Yeah, well, poetry can be interesting, definitely, especially coming from the thinker, as I mentioned in my poem. I'll read to you a simple poem that I wrote about this subject.
Oh, great.
I call it Tip. Walk. Do not run. Be patient. Do not rush. Be honest. Grow wiser. Keep healthy. Stay young.
Wow. It's nice.
Thank you.
And what was the title? You said Tip?
Tip.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of a tip. Thinking I am a philosopher, trying to be nice to somebody who says, what should I do? Well,
I know both you and I are fellow songwriters, so you mentioned that poetry can be a melody.
oh, definitely. Poetry has music in it, or it should have music in it. I'm not saying that all poems have to have a melody behind the reading, behind the meaning, but yes, poetry has a melody that is lovable.
Now, if you're reading a poem, can you actually see or actually feel the melody in the poem you're reading?
Absolutely, absolutely. Sometimes I write poems by listening to a melody. And the melody itself, not a song, I'm just talking about the music. The melody can provide the rhythm of what I want to say in verse.
Is there such a thing as a poem that's written off rhythm or without rhythm?
Yes, they happen. In the so-called style of free verse, it happens all the time. There's no music. If you read Walt Whitman, for example, there's no music. But there is meaning behind what he says, which is a different story. It's, what you want. You want to dance? Or you want to think about... So, Walt Whitman got away with it. He was great writing what I call poetic prose. He called it free verse, and a lot of people say, but it's no melody, it's no music. But it works because of the meaning of what is being conveyed.
We're in 2022, and the type of poetry that you mentioned, everybody deals with, depression. You said poetry can be depression.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people in our society are depressed for one thing, for one reason or another. And when that type of a depression hits the mind is telling the poet to write about her feelings, and the feelings come out depressed.
Do you have something you can read?
There is a poem I wrote a long time ago, maybe about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Separation. And I'll read it to you.
Sure, thank you.
I am human and a fool who fights against any shadows made by the flames of my mood. Between walls of my own cave, by the fire I remain. At the mercy of the muse, I'm a poet who's been captured by the kindness and seduction of her lips, as sensual as far away. Yes, her kiss and my reaction, when I measured that long distance that separates her from me. It's a kind of a feeling that makes the poet think, oh, I'm depressed. It happens.
Again, 2022, what we're dealing with every day, 24/7 on the news. You said poetry can be political.
With all the events going on in the world right now, poetry can be political, definitely.
And kind of a sidebar to political, you said poetry can also be crude?
Yes, because if there is a shrewd mind, can pick up any subject, political, religious, from society, and transform that into something really cruel, to the point where people who read those words can be not only offended, they can be hurt, because words are powerful. You know, they say the written word is a sword that can really cut.
You talked before in the poem, and you mentioned that another form of poetry or theme of poetry is irrational, which we're dealing with a lot of irrational people these days. What do you mean by that?
The irrational behavior in humans in today's society is obvious. We are at the point of our civilization where nothing makes sense. And that applies to the poet also. The poet sits down, writing his verses, and they're irrational. But in the poet's mind, they're okay.
I know one form of poetry you mentioned, a lot of people tend to shy away from. You said poetry can be obscene.
Poetry can be obscene if we don't take care of the proper words. I know there is freedom of speech. We know that. I am a pro activist on freedom of speech. But when we abuse the speech to inflict pain on somebody, that's not good. And that happens.
You also mentioned that poetry can be senseless. Is that true?
Of course. Again, in the poet's mind, the verses are written, making sense, only for the poet. Somebody else reading those verses day after, a week after, a month after, a year after, what the hell is he talking about? It doesn't make any sense. And yet in the poet's mind, they make a lot of sense at the time the poem was written. But keep in mind that you are a poet yourself. When you write something and you read it a year later, you say to yourself, why in the heck did I write this kind of crap?
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. But at the time we write it, in the heat of the moment, we are so passionate that we don't realize. Well, the same applies to when a poet goes out in the world and read the poetry or write the poems for somebody else.
Do you have a poem about being senseless?
Senseless. Some time ago I wrote a poem called Emptiness, because a senseless poet is empty. It's empty. It's just the way it is. Anyway, I'm going to read Emptiness. Justice cannot be served on any farm where the rain falls out of tune, while the rotten fruits abandoned end up in a nearly lagoon. The poem itself may not make sense to somebody else. I may have to read it again so that people say, what?
Yeah, could you read that again slower? Because like you said, people are like, what did he just say?
Justice cannot be served on any farm where the rain falls out of tune, while the rotten fruits abandoned end up in a nearby lagoon. This is a poem that also has to be explained a lot. And people don't have the time to read it for the third time and then go through an explanation of the words and the meaning. And that is what I meant by poetry can be senseless.
Senseless, yeah. You also said that poetry can be cruel. Not to be confused with Don't Be Cruel by Elvis.
Yeah, poetry can be cruel anytime we insult people, anytime we attack people at the personal level. It's very harmful.
Now, the worst thing ever for poets like ourselves is, you said poetry can be lost. What does you mean by that?
Poetry can be lost. If we are not able to convey the thoughts properly, even though in our mind we have written a nice piece of poetry, the poem can be lost completely, gone forever. Nobody will ever remember.
Once again, Mr. Martin, we want to thank you for your time. Loved your poem, loved all your explanations, and also the samples of the poetry you read based on the different themes. Now, keeping that in mind, which theme are you most comfortable with writing yourself?
I personally like poetry that people can understand. I am not, or I don't think I am an abstract poet. I am not an intellectual poet. I'm a simple guy that writes poetry. And my poems are descriptive and using narrative. That is the type of poetry I do enjoy. I mean, I can be romantic, I can be political, I can be religious, but my poetry is simple and to the point. There is a poem in particular that I wrote a long time ago. Actually, the poem was written in 1996 for something that happened in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area.
Oh, do you have that handy?
Yes, I do. The poem is called On April the 9th. And I wrote it that April the 9th of 1995. Because it happened. And yet, the same thing happened in the year 2000. And 2016.
Wow.
I'll read it to you. On April the 9th. This morning, I looked through the window to find a new day born out of April. Born out of April in the silence of snow. It is winter, icy and cold. Nature unmercifully whips the ground with impeccable white flakes of soft snow. This morning, I looked through the window to say, "Oh my Lord," not on the 9th day of April, when the grass and flowers grow.
That's great.
That
You
is what I
said
got
three
descriptive.
different times that happened on the same day now?
Yes, it did happen.
That's
like
crazy.
I said, I did mention it. It happened in the Philadelphia area in 1995 and also in 2000 and 2016
Wow.
on April the 9th.
Huh.
People may not remember, but this is what I call descriptive poetry, narrative poetry. People read it, people hear it, people listen to it, pay attention to it, and say, "Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, he's right." You can go through the calendar or the newspapers and find out that it happened 3 times
That's
in
amazing.
our lives.
In reference to your work, I know you published many, many books. We've done a lot of interviews. Once again, for everyone watching this, and everyone's sharing this. Give us your contact information where we can purchase your books.
The books can be purchased through the internet, through the platforms of lulu.com, who is an entity that has published most of my books. Barnes and Noble, of course, Amazon is always there. And I'm not making a commercial for all these organizations, but it is a place where you can acquire the books. Click my name, Emiliano Martin, author of books or something like that, or poetry author, or anything related to poetry. And my name will come in the several platforms offered by the internet, and the books can be delivered at home easily. You don't even have to go to the store. Amazon is a perfect supplier. Lulu.com is the publisher itself. They also do a nice package of the mailing of the books, and it's a very convenient way to purchase books these days because people don't go out, the malls are dying, the bookstores are suffering, but in the internet everything is available.
Do you have any advice to any of your fans who are watching this to want to write based on some of those themes that you talked about here?
My advice is keep writing at anything you observe, about anything you see. One thing will lead you to another. If you watch the news, you can write political subjects. We have politics every day. If you watch what's going on about the war in foreign countries, unfortunately, you can write about the war. You can write about the soldiers. You can write about peace. There's a lot of subjects out there that we can absorb and expand in poetry.
What kind of new books can we expect from you on the horizon?
I'm writing on 2 manuscripts right now, one in Spanish and another one in English. And the English will have about 100 poems. I'm working on. I'm still revising the poem because I keep changing every day. I did mention earlier that I write something one day and then a week later, oh, I don't want to say that, and then I have to change it. So these things happen.
Do you have a title for the English book?
Not yet.
How about the Spanish book?
I have a temporary title for the manuscript. It's called Legends and Histories of the Spanish Culture.
Is that going to be in Spanish?
It's going to be in Spanish.
So what would it sound like in Spanish?
Leyendas e Historias de España. That would be the title. But that may change because I always said, with my mood, I'll always change anything that comes to mind.
Mr. Martin, once again, all of us here at Inside the Artist want to thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you for allowing us to watch these videos, learn from these videos, and purchase your books so we have them at home. If we can't watch the video, we can grab your book and start reading it. Again, this is John J. Ruppert for Inside the Artist. Mr. Martin, thank you very much. Till we see you again, be safe and be creative.
Thank you.
Inside the Artist wishes to thank our viewers for their continued support, and our special guest today, renowned author, poet, and artist Emiliano Martin. To purchase his wonderful books, please visit lulu.com, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, or simply search Emiliano Martin on the web. This was recorded, directed, produced, and hosted by John J. Ruppert, August 16th, 2022. Hit subscribe to see all of our interviews and other content on this channel. YouTube.com JJ Root Promotions. Be safe and be creative.